Thank you, Ed. That was very kind of you. In order to understand the Freedom Rides, it is essential to know that the core Freedom Riders who initiated the rides and who became the victims of Klan violence in Anniston and Birmingham were a completely different group from the Freedom Riders who subsequently came to Montgomery. I want today to focus on the Montgomery Freedom Rides, but before I turn to the events in Montgomery, I need briefly to explain the background of the initial Freedom Rides, the ones sponsored by CORE. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, was founded by a group of students at the University of Chicago in 1942 as a part of a campaign to compel downtown Chicago restaurants to accept black customers. In June 1946, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the case of Morgan versus Virginia that racial segregation of interstate bus passengers was an unconstitutional burden on interstate commerce. But despite the general implications of this decision, it was simply ignored everywhere in the South. In April 1947, a group of 16 CORE members led by the black pacifist Bayard Rustin undertook an integrated bus trip through the South to demonstrate that the Morgan decision was not being obeyed. The result was a series of arrests through Virginia and North Carolina, culminating in a near riot in Chapel Hill that sent Rustin and two white co-defendants to jail for 30 days at hard labor. CORE's 1947 effort essentially accomplished nothing, but it lived on in the organization's institutional memory. Then, in December 1960, the Supreme Court ruled in Boynton versus Virginia that the segregation of bus terminal restaurants and other facilities was also illegal. Just as with the Morgan decision 14 years earlier, the general implications of the Boynton ruling simply were disregarded throughout the South. And so the leaders of CORE turned once again to the idea of an interracial bus trip through the region to show that the Boynton holding was being ignored. On May 4th, 1961, 7 black and 6 white Freedom Riders left Washington, D.C. As in 1947, they traveled in 2 groups as paying passengers aboard regularly scheduled buses of Greyhound and Trailways. As they proceeded southward, there were arrests in Charlotte, North Carolina and Winnsboro, South Carolina, and 2 of the Freedom Riders were assaulted in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And then, on the morning of May 14th, the Freedom Riders left Atlanta for Birmingham. The group aboard Greyhound made it only as far as Anniston. During the brief stop at the Anniston station, a Klansman, Roger D. Couch, managed to puncture one of the bus's tires. About 4 miles west of Anniston, the bus driver, O.P. Jones, was therefore compelled to pull the bus to the side of the road. At this point, one of the following Klansmen, taxi driver Dalford Roberts, succeeded in breaking the bus's right rear window, and another one, machinist Cecil Goober Llewellyn, then threw a lighted incendiary device through it into the vehicle. Other Klansmen, led by florist Jerry R. Eason, sought to hold the bus door closed to prevent the passengers from escaping. But arriving highway patrolmen drove them back, and the passengers poured out of the bus just as it was engulfed in flame. There had been no serious injuries, but it had been a very close call. While these events were taking place, the Trailways bus, operating on a somewhat later schedule, was proceeding towards Birmingham. As soon as the bus arrived at the Birmingham station, a mob composed of Klansmen and National States Rights Party members rushed to attack the passengers. both Freedom Riders and other passengers, since both the Trailways and the Greyhound buses had contained passengers who were simply traveling from Atlanta to Birmingham and had no inkling that a demonstration was underway until they found themselves suddenly caught up in these events. One of the most badly beaten persons at the Birmingham terminal, for instance, was George Webb, a young Birmingham black man who had simply come to the station to collect his fiancée who was arriving aboard the bus. As the riot continued, Birmingham police were nowhere to be found, even though the Trailway station was located across the street from police headquarters. City Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, it turned out, had promised to allow the Klan 10 to 15 minutes of uninterrupted mayhem before police intervened. In return, Connor had received solid Klan support in the city election, which had taken place only 12 days earlier, on May 2nd. Pictures of the riot taken by a Birmingham Post-Herald photographer later permitted the conviction of 3 of the Klansmen for disorderly conduct, and they each served 30 days in jail. But the rioter indicted for attempted murder for the assault on George Webb, pulpwood mill worker Herschel W. Acker, was promptly acquitted. The jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes. Though bruised and battered, the Freedom Riders were reluctant to abandon their demonstration. But they now fell under heavy pressure from the Justice Department. Attorney General Robert Kennedy dispatched his aide, John Siegenthaler, to Birmingham with instructions to impress upon the rioters the likelihood of additional violence if they continued. And in any case, bus drivers, frightened particularly by the events in Anniston, refused to take them further. As a result, the Freedom Riders yielded. They flew on by plane to New Orleans, which had been their ultimate destination, and there they held a rally and dispersed. That was the end of the original Corps-sponsored Freedom Ride. And if the Kennedy administration had had its way, it would have been the end of the entire episode as well. But the administration was reckoning without John Lewis. John Lewis, today the congressman from Atlanta, grew up in rural Pike County near the Banks community. His ambition was to become a minister, and he enrolled in the American Baptist Seminary in Nashville, Tennessee. There he met and became an active member of a group of young black social reformers centered around the Reverend James Lawson, who had recently returned to the United States from India, where he had studied Gandhian tactics of passive resistance. This group in 1960 launched what would prove a successful campaign to integrate Nashville's restaurants and soda fountains. Lewis, deeply inspired by his participation in this campaign, had volunteered the following year to join the Corps Freedom Ride. He was one of the riders who had been assaulted in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Following this assault, Lewis was forced to leave the ride, but with the intention of rejoining it in Birmingham. Before he could get to Birmingham, however, he found that his fellow riders had voted to abandon the protest and were on their way to the airport. Profoundly upset and disappointed, he contacted Diane Nash, a Fisk University undergraduate who had led the Nashville sit-ins the year before, and argued to her that to yield in this way to Klan violence would strengthen the Klan and set back the cause of civil rights. Nash agreed and at once began gathering the students who had conducted the Nashville sit-ins to discuss continuing the original Freedom Riders' plan. As a result, Lewis was soon on his way to Birmingham, together with 16 other black and 3 white student volunteers. Commissioner Connor promptly arrested the entire group and returned them to the Tennessee line, but within hours they were all back in Birmingham seeking a bus to Montgomery. Initially, because of the danger to both drivers and buses, neither Greyhound nor Trailways would take them, and the Birmingham station where the demonstrators were stuck was soon surrounded by a large and angry mob. In the meantime, however, John Siegenthaler came to Montgomery and managed to negotiate with Governor John Patterson and Highway Patrol Director Floyd Mann a guarantee of the bus's safety. With this assurance, Greyhound agreed to accept the demonstrators, and the bus left Birmingham, with only the Freedom Riders aboard and accompanied by 16 state patrol cars and a state airplane. At the Montgomery city limits, however, the Highway Patrol escort left the bus. Its protection was now the responsibility of Montgomery City Police. City Commissioner L.B. Sullivan had assured both Governor Patterson and Floyd Mann that his police would safeguard the bus, and both of them were confident that they could rely on his word. But as it quickly became apparent, they could not. To understand what happened next, I must now leave this narrative for a moment and turn to a description of what had happened to Montgomery as a result of the end of the city's bus boycott of 1955-56. The integration of Montgomery City buses on December 21, 1956, had been followed by an explosion of Klan violence, culminating in a wave of bombings of black churches and homes on the mornings of January 10th and 27th, 1957. Business leaders of the Chamber of Commerce and the men of Montgomery, deeply worried about the effect of this violence on the city's reputation, placed very public pressure on city authorities to apprehend those responsible for the bombings. And under this pressure, the police announced the arrest of 7 Klansmen for the crimes on January 30th. But their arrest and indictment produced an enormous outpouring of sympathy and support for them among the city's whites. 2 rival campaigns to collect funds for their defense were launched, one conducted by the White Citizens Council and the other by the Klan, with solicitors going from door to door in white neighborhoods and manning collection buckets on downtown streets. The first 2 of the Klansmen to come to trial, Sonny Livingston and Raymond Britt, were acquitted despite their confessions and irrefutable evidence against them. As a result, the racially moderate business leaders who had championed the prosecutions retreated into cowering silence. During the years from 1957 to 1961, the city slipped into a surreal dimension in which only extremist views were publicly voiced among whites, and any hint of deviation from white supremacist orthodoxy incurred active harassment and social ostracism. As the White Citizens Council proclaimed in a statement in January 1959, "We believe that any person who speaks, writes, or in any way advocates or works for anything short of total and complete segregation will be ostracized and will earn and will receive the condemnation of the public. We feel sure that an aroused and informed public will make it unprofitable and uncomfortable for any person to remain in our community if he is not willing to support the will of our community in this matter." One utterly unexpected and highly ironic victim of this new extremist conformity was Montgomery's stridently segregationist city commissioner, Clyde C. Sellers, who was the commissioner who supervised the police department. Sellers had been an early and outspoken supporter of the White Citizens Council. But when the police broke the bombing cases in January 1957, Klansmen began charging, quite incredibly, that the arrests represented Commissioner Sellers' effort to gain the support of the black bloc vote. Klan elements within the police force encouraged this notion because Sellers had, in fact, favored and promoted officers who belonged to the White Citizens Council rather than the Klan. And that policy had produced deep divisions within the police department. Then, an event in 1958 had lent broader credence to the Klan's charges against the commissioner. Presumably at Sellers' direction, the police had been keeping surveillance of the Reverend Ralph D. Abernathy, minister of the Black First Baptist Church, and along with Martin Luther King, the city's most prominent civil rights leader. Through this surveillance, they had stumbled accidentally onto the fact that Abernathy was conducting an affair with the wife of one of his parishioners, Edward Davis, and they quietly informed Davis of this fact. The enraged Davis stormed into Abernathy's office and attacked him with a hatchet. Police, parked nearby, quickly took Davis into custody and charged him with attempted murder. Abernathy was summoned to Davis's preliminary hearing as the principal witness. Martin Luther King accompanied the Abernathys to the hearing, and as they were waiting on the sidewalk outside City Hall for the hearing to begin, police officers proceeded to arrest King and charge him with loitering. King was then tried on this absurd charge, convicted, and fined $10. King refused to pay and announced that he preferred to go to jail in order to dramatize what he quite understandably regarded as the injustice of these proceedings. Recognizing that jailing King under these circumstances would draw nationwide negative publicity for the city, Commissioner Sellers thereupon personally paid King's fine and ordered him released. Commissioner Sellers' payment of King's fine, very probably the most intelligent act of Sellers' entire public career, was the source of his political doom. Extreme segregationists were now convinced that Sellers was a surreptitious moderate. In the city elections of 1959, L.B. Sullivan, a former director of the State Highway Patrol who ran against him, turned the action into the principal issue of the campaign, calling it using kid gloves in the handling of racial agitators. The Klan element that had raised money for the defense of the bombers in 1957 now became the backbone of Sullivan's campaign organization. Sullivan won with about 53% of the vote. His first decision on taking office was to remove the head of the police department's detective division, E.P. Tiny Brown, who had directed the investigation that had broken the bombing cases, and to replace him with future city commissioner Jack Rucker, who was the leader of the Klan faction within the police force. Thus, when Governor Patterson and Highway Patrol Director Floyd Mann contacted Commissioner Sullivan about providing protection for the Freedom Riders in May 1961, there was perhaps no politician in Alabama who knew better how easily an opponent could use against him an action such as safeguarding racial demonstrators. He knew because he had used exactly that sort of charge to defeat Clyde Sellers in 1959. Sullivan therefore determined to pass the word quietly to his friends in the Klan that should any disorder occur at the bus station, the police could be counted on not to intervene. The Klan would have its day. The Freedom Riders bus was met at the Montgomery Greyhound station on May 20th by a mob initially numbering some 200, but growing eventually to 1,000, led by Claude V. Henley, an assistant service manager at a Montgomery automobile dealership, and a longtime member of the city's volunteer reserve police force, through which he had become close friends with many of the regular officers. Urged on by Henley, the mob soon turned its particular attention to the only white male among the Freedom Riders, James Zwerg of Appleton, Wisconsin, who was an exchange student at Nashville's Fisk University. Some 25 rioters beat Zwerg into unconsciousness, and then 3 of them held him up so that a woman could kick him in the groin. Arriving at the station in the midst of this melee, Floyd Mann discovered for the first time that he had been betrayed. He waded into the midst of the mob with his pistol drawn, and straddling the unconscious body of Freedom Rider William Barbee, he personally arrested the Klansman who had been beating Barbee on the head with a baseball bat, Thurman Ousds. He then ran back to his car and put in a call for highway patrol reinforcements. There were several police officers on the scene, but they were engaged only in directing traffic. "Why didn't you call Sullivan?" Mann demanded of one of the officers. And he replied, "The men he would send out probably would have joined the mob." Sullivan later issued a statement saying that police have no intention of standing guard for a bunch of troublemakers. In fact, police made only 5 arrests during the entire riot, and 2 of those were Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Gatch, white passers-by whose offense was to try to obtain medical aid for the injured. In later fining them $300, Recorder's Court Judge Eugene Lowe ruled that Mrs. Gatch had caused the mob to become inflamed by telling them that they should be ashamed of themselves. About an hour and a quarter had begun, 65 highway patrolmen arrived in response to Mann's summons. Shortly thereafter, the county's mounted sheriff's posse also arrived. And with the highway patrolmen and the sheriff's deputies now actively clearing the area, Montgomery police at last responded in force. A total of 20 Freedom Riders, newsmen, and bystanders were. Throughout these events, the Kennedy administration had been very reluctant to intervene because both John and Robert Kennedy felt especially for Patterson, who had been one of the very first public figures in the United States to endorse John Kennedy's campaign for the presidency in June 1959, more than a year before the Democratic Convention. And in addition, though it was not publicly known at the time, the president was also deeply Alabama Air National Guard assistance for the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, which had taken place just a few weeks earlier. Police department to maintain order at the bus station, the Kennedys were finally forced into action. The president ordered the dispatch of 400 U.S. Marshals to the city late that night. As it turned out, Kennedy's action came none too soon. The next day, May 21st, Martin Luther King returned to Montgomery from his new home in Atlanta to hold a protest rally at his friend Ralph Abernathy's church. As the rally got underway that night, a mob gathered in the park across from the church, today the site of the city's police headquarters. The U.S. Marshals, under the command of future Supreme Court Justice Byron White, at the time an Assistant Attorney General, attempted to create a cordon along Ripley Street to separate the mob from the church. The rioters set fire to a car driven by the noted British writer Jessica Mitford, and then pressed forward to test the marshals' cordon, throwing bricks and rocks. The marshals fired tear gas, but it blew away from the mob and into the church. Initially, city police had left the marshals to fend for themselves. But about half an hour after the riot began, highway patrolmen arrived to assist, and at that point, police also intervened. The mob then broke up into roving bands that overturned cars and shot into at least 4 black homes in a nearby public housing project. Elsewhere in the city, 2 homes of persons the Klan considered enemies, one white and one black, were firebombed. About an hour and a quarter after the beginning of the riot, Governor Patterson was persuaded to sign a proclamation placing Montgomery under martial law and mobilizing units of the National Guard. By midnight, about 4 hours after the riot had begun, guardsmen had succeeded in restoring order, and at dawn, the besieged congregation was finally permitted to leave the church. The city would remain under martial law until May 29th. May 20th and 21st, though among the darkest days in all of Montgomery's history, proved to be the great turning point in the city's struggle to emerge from the nightmare of extremist conformity into which it had been plunged by the white community's response to the bus boycott. The central figure in this transformation was wealthy construction executive Winton M. Red Blunt, who, in common with many of the city's moderate business leaders, by the violence, and was deeply concerned that it might damage efforts to attract new industry to the area. Acting through the president of the Chamber of Commerce, gasoline distributor Edgar W. Stewart, Blunt summoned a meeting of more than 100 of Montgomery's business and professional leaders at the Chamber's offices. Blunt and Stewart urged them to endorse a strong condemnation of the riots. But this proposal ran up against the feeling general among whites that the violence had occurred only because of the Freedom Riders' provocation. Conservative attorney T.B. Hill argued this position forcefully. At this point, Blunt demonstrated his strategic skill. He invited Hill to draft resolutions that Hill himself would find acceptable. The result was a statement that, though it denounced the Freedom Riders for coming into our community for the avowed purpose of violating our time-honored and respected laws, nevertheless continued by asserting firmly, "We do not under any circumstances approve or condone mob action on the part of any faction, and we do hereby call upon the law enforcement agencies of our city, county, and state to take all necessary action and precautions to maintain and preserve law and order in our community." 87 of the leaders present agreed to endorse this statement. On the morning of May 22nd, the Board of Directors of the Chamber of Commerce formally adopted these resolutions. At their luncheon meetings later that day, the Rotary and Kiwanis clubs voted to endorse them as well. Again, Blunt, who was the Rotary Club's vice president, was the chief mover. That afternoon, the White Montgomery Ministerial Association adopted somewhat stronger resolutions, and the next day, the Junior Chamber of Commerce adopted even stronger ones. Finally, on May 25th, the Board of Directors of the Alabama State Chamber of Commerce, again at the instance of Blunt, who was the organization's president-elect, adopted the strongest statement yet, affirming that all laws and court decisions, however distasteful to any group, can and must be enforced by lawfully constituted agencies of government, and calling upon all local and state officials to preserve law and order in Alabama under all conditions and at all costs. Montgomery Advertiser editor Grover C. Hull recognized how important this series of resolutions was. In the years since the bus boycott, he noted in an editorial, organized originators of public opinion, such as civic clubs, were silent and passive in the teeth of local violence. This left the field and the pinheads time to wash out. But at last, the conditions here degenerated to the point of necessary shock and resolutions, he continued, even though timid, represented a turning point, an assertion of leadership and intervention in the destinies of this city. And the future would prove Hull correct. City authorities, who earlier had felt pressure only from white supremacist extremists on their right, now found themselves under pressure from the moderate business leadership on their left. On May 22nd, some 30 business and professional leaders met with Mayor Earl James for more than 2 hours. From this meeting dates the reintroduction into city politics of a coherent and determined white moderate voice. And because of this pressure and the new support that the business community could offer them, first Mayor James and Commissioner Frank Parks, and eventually even Commissioner L.B. Sullivan, began to move to less obdurate positions. Sullivan would eventually be the commissioner who would preside over the racial integration of Montgomery's police force in 1964. The second major result of the riots came from Washington, D.C. On May 29th, the same day that martial law ended in Montgomery, Attorney General Kennedy responded to these events by filing a petition with the Interstate Commerce Commission asking for an order compelling all bus stations everywhere in the nation to open all of their facilities to all passengers without distinction of race. The Commission granted this petition on September 22nd to take effect on November 1st. All previous decisions of the federal courts, however broad their implications, actually affected only the parties to the suit, and the implications could be realized only by filing suit against all the comparable institutions in all the thousands of other towns and cities throughout the South. The result was that, despite the newspaper headlines about Supreme Court decisions, nothing really changed. Segregation remained universal. That had been the case with the Morgan and Boynton decisions that had led to the Freedom Rides, and with many scores of others like them, such as Brown versus Board of Education. As white supremacists saw segregation stand immovable in practice, despite the judicial challenge, they had increasingly become convinced that they were winning the battle. The White Citizens Council statement of January 1959, from which I quoted earlier, had concluded confidently that when the history of the Second Reconstruction is written, Montgomery will be recorded as the place where the tide was turned and integration efforts were stopped cold. This attitude was general among segregationists around the region. But the order of the Interstate Commerce Commission, unlike the federal court decisions, for the very first time brought integration all at once to an entire class of institutions in every town and hamlet in every state in the South, and brought it in a way that, because of the ICC's inspectors and its enforcement powers, the institutions could not evade. It was the very first real blow to the segregationists' belief that they were winning. The first clear proof that the federal government's executive and legislative branches, if they could be brought into the battle, possessed the power to overwhelm the segregationist defenses. It was this realization that would eventually erode the white supremacists' confidence in their power to determine the shape of Southern race relations by themselves. And it was because of this growing realization that their confidence eventually gave way to sullen resignation. Thus, the reemergence of the white moderates into active participation in municipal life and the decline of the segregationists' aggressive assuredness both can be dated in Montgomery to the events surrounding the Freedom Rider riots. And it was the interaction of these two developments with increasing black resolution that would eventually transform the life of the city. Thank you. I'm delighted to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
Just one moment, please. One moment. Let us hand you a microphone. If you will, raise your hand if you have a question. There are attendees in the next overflow auditorium, the Milo Howard Room, and they would like to hear the questions, and only through the microphone.
What was it that brought the State Patrol Chief Mann down to the Greyhound station that day?
Well, he had, of course, given his word that the bus was going to be protected, and it was all the way up to the city limits. He was under the impression that the city police at that point were going to take over from the highway patrol. The city police had jurisdiction within the city limits. Of course, the highway patrol outside the police jurisdiction. And he came to the station simply to check that everything was going all right. He expected that it was. When he arrived, he discovered for the first time that there was a riot going on.
Follow-up question. Were there federal officials from Washington in the U.S. courthouse observing the riot?
Yes. John Doerr was, who was the Assistant Attorney General, was in the federal courthouse up on the second floor in the anteroom of Judge Frank Johnson's chambers, looking out the window, watching the developing events and talking all the while on the telephone with Attorney General Robert Kennedy in Washington and giving him a blow-by-blow description of the events as they emerged. So Robert Kennedy actually had a real-time, moment-by-moment of the riots going on. That's one of the reasons that the Kennedys, who, as I said, were devoted to Governor Patterson and did not want to do anything that would place Patterson in a difficult political position, they were driven, they were almost driven into taking some action. And one of the reasons was that though John Doerr was in the post office, John Siegenthaler, Robert Kennedy's aide, executive assistant, was out in the parking area of the bus station, and he was among those attacked. He was attempting to get one of the white female. There were two white. There was one white male and two white female participants, and the two white females, Susan Wilbur and Susan Herman, were being pursued by the mob, and Siegenthaler drove up in his car to attempt to get them in the back seat of the car because he was going to attempt to arrest them. And as he jumped out of the car to get them into the back seat, he was himself assaulted by the Klan, by the rioters, knocked unconscious, and left there. He was unconscious for more than a half an hour, lying on the concrete there, and it was John Doerr's report to Robert Kennedy that John Siegenthaler had just been knocked out, and for all John Doerr could see, might be dead. That that sparked Robert Kennedy to contact the White House and urge action.
Thank you.
Mills, to what extent do you think that the extreme violence of events here in Montgomery and elsewhere had impact on the federal judicial system in the South, and particularly with respect to Judge Frank Johnson?
That's a very interesting question. The tendency in most depictions of Frank Johnson is to emphasize his judicial career after the Freedom Rider riots, when he becomes essentially the most firm enforcer of civil rights decisions of any federal district judge in the South, and an absolutely fierce opponent of any evasion. But that actually dates from the Freedom Rider riots. Frank Johnson was a moderate Republican. He was an appointee of Dwight Eisenhower. He came from Winston County in the northern part of the state, where Republicans had remained strong, and had been active in the Republican Party. And President Eisenhower rewarded him. He had been U.S. Attorney for the Northern District in Birmingham. And then President Eisenhower appointed him U.S. District Judge. His early decisions after his appointment during the Eisenhower years and up to the Freedom Rider riots are very moderate and careful. And even though he's willing to follow emerging precedent from the U.S. Supreme Court when he has to do so, he's much more like the other Eisenhower appointee, Hobart Grooms, who is the federal district judge in Birmingham, one of the two in Birmingham. It really is, I think, with Frank Johnson, as with so many people in Montgomery, so many people, black and white, in Montgomery, astonishment and horror at the extent of the violence at the time of the Freedom Rider riots that pushed Frank Johnson into a much more aggressive posture. And most of the decisions that we associate with Frank Johnson are after 1961. Before 1961, Frank Johnson was the judge whose decision essentially gutted the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and compelled the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1960 to correct the flaws in the act that Johnson had focused on and that had led him to gut the earlier act. There's a long discussion of this in my Dividing Lines book, and so I won't go into all of it. But there's a long list of extraordinarily conservative decisions by Johnson before 1961 that really stand in stark contrast to the kinds of decisions he began issuing after 1961.
Mills, what was the role of Sheriff Maxim Butler in this melee?
Well, he does not play any significant role other than dispatching the volunteer-mounted sheriff's posse. All of these things, just the logistics of the situation bear some clarification. After Floyd Mann put in his call on his police radio in his car. It took a good while, of course, for highway patrolmen to get to Montgomery because they're scattered all around out patrolling the highways. That's what the highway patrol does. They're not in cities. So they all have to be summoned in, and it takes quite a while for them to get in. Similarly with the mounted volunteer sheriff's posse, what that is mainly cattle ranchers in southern Montgomery County who have horses, and because they have horses, they have volunteered on a volunteer basis to be this mounted posse if they're called upon. But they have, when the call goes out, which came from Sheriff Butler, but when the call did go out, then it took quite a while because they have to get their horses and put them in trailers and hook the trailers on the back of the cars and bring them into town, so that takes quite a while. So that it's substantially more than an hour after the riot began that the sheriff's deputies and the highway patrolmen actually show up. And the city police do nothing until these other law enforcement agencies are engaged. That's really the only connection between the Freedom Rider riots and Sheriff Butler. Sheriff Butler plays a much role in the disorders at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. He does play a central role in that, but not in this episode.
When were the federal marshals called in, and who were they, and how many of those were there? Where did they come from?
Yeah, I said that. So President Kennedy sent in these 400 U.S. Marshals on the night of May 20th in response to the disorders and the failure of the Montgomery Police Department to act under the command of the future U.S. Supreme Court Justice Byron White, and they, who at that time is simply an Assistant Attorney General under Robert Kennedy, they began arriving from all over the United States. Now, I'll say a word about that. Kennedy could have and undoubtedly should have used troops. There were troops available. Fort Benning was not far away. Fort Rucker is not far away. He could have called upon troops, and troops would have been a much better answer than marshals, because marshals. There weren't a lot of marshals, and they weren't trained for this sort of activity. So what the Kennedy administration had to do in order, when the president ordered the dispatch of these marshals, they had to go around and round up such federal employees as they had. So they were conservation agents, they were guides at the national parks, they were whoever the administration could find who was a federal employee. They were sworn in and sent to Montgomery that night, late at night. This is all going late at night during the night of May 20th, 21st. They're arriving around 2 or 3 in the morning at Maxwell Air Force Base. And they don't really know what to do. And so when they're plunged into this situation at the Black First Baptist Church, they really have never had any training in riot control, and they're all at sea, and that's part of the problem there. The reason Kennedy turned to marshals rather than troops had to do with the extent of Southern members of Congress, the extent to which Southern members of Congress had criticized President Eisenhower for using troops at Little Rock during the Central High School integration crisis. It had been a principal source of of criticism from Southern members of Congress. Now, President Eisenhower didn't rely on them because he was a Republican, but President Kennedy relied completely on the Southern members of the Democratic Party in Congress. They were his party, and it was their job to get his program through Congress. And he had to be completely at one with them and do nothing that would upset them. And so he turned to marshals. He would have preferred to do nothing, but since he had to do something, he turned to marshals rather than troops, precisely because he thought that the marshals would arouse less opposition from Southern members of Congress who, if troops were dispatched, would raise the echoes of Little Rock.